The year was 1878. The month was November, and the cold had teeth. Agnes stood on the hard-packed dirt road, a thin wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The wind found every gap in the weave. In her left hand, she held a flour sack, its weight comprising 2 books and a hunk of dry bread. In her right, she held a small, squirming burlap bag that contained her only companion, an old orange cat named Marmalade. The cold did not care about her grief. The mountains, jagged and white against a steel-grey sky, did not care about her eviction. Her brother-in-law, Martin, stood in the doorway of the house that was no longer hers. He held the door half-closed, a barrier against the future as much as the wind. "A widow's portion is charity," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all warmth. "And this house has run out of charity for a woman who prefers the company of books to people." He shut the door. The sound was a simple click of the latch, but it felt like a gunshot. Agnes turned and walked, her worn boots crunching on the frozen ground. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. She walked past the edge of the small settlement, toward the dark line of pines. Tucked into the bottom of her flour sack, unknown to Martin, unknown to anyone, was a single, heavy, and strangely wrought iron key. She had found it in her late husband's effects, a key that fit no lock she had ever seen. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from in the world, as we trace the steps of a woman left with nothing but a key to a door that did not yet exist. Her husband, Daniel, had understood her. He had seen her quiet intensity not as strangeness, but as a different kind of intelligence. While other women in the settlement of Prairie Ridge gathered to mend and gossip, Agnes would be reading. She read almanacs, agricultural pamphlets sent from the east, geology surveys left behind by prospectors. Daniel would find her on the porch, a book open in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the way the clouds gathered over the peaks. He never chided her. He would bring her a cup of water and ask, "What is the sky telling you today, Agnes?" She would tell him about the way the wind shifted, or how the color of the sunset predicted a hard frost. He listened. He had been a quiet man who understood quiet things. When the fever took him in the spring, it took the one person in the world who spoke her language. Her brother-in-law, Martin, a man of blunt faith and even blunter practicality, took her in as duty required. His wife, Sarah, saw Agnes as a silent judgment. Agnes did not waste thread. She did not waste words. She would sit by the fire, mending Martin's work shirts with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. But her mind was elsewhere. They could feel it. She would pause, her needle in mid-air, to watch a spider build a web in the corner of the room, her focus absolute. She would crumble soil from the garden between her fingers, studying its texture, its moisture, its life, with a reverence they reserved for scripture. This unnerved them. Her knowledge was practical, but it felt pagan. She knew which wild greens were safe to eat, which roots could be ground into a poultice for a cough, and which mushrooms would grow on the north side of a fallen log. She learned this not from a neighbor, but from a dog-eared book on botany she had traded a jar of preserves for. The community saw this as unnatural. Knowledge was meant to be passed down from a mother or a preacher, not gleaned from the silent pages of a book. The whispers started small. "She reads more than she prays," a neighbor noted to Sarah over a fence post. It was not a compliment. It was an accusation. Agnes tried to contribute. She showed Martin how to rotate his small crop of corn with beans to put life back into the tired soil. He grunted, followed her advice, and when the corn grew taller than anyone else's, he took the credit as a blessing from God for his own hard work. He never mentioned her part in it. Her presence was a constant, low-grade irritation in his house. She was a ghost at his table, a reminder of his dead brother and a duty he resented. The final break came over a simple matter. One of Martin's goats was sick, refusing to eat. The preacher had prayed over it. Martin had been ready to butcher it before the sickness spoiled the meat. Agnes, after watching the animal for a day, had walked into the hills and returned with a handful of willow bark and yarrow. She brewed a tea and patiently coaxed the goat to drink. Within 2 days, the animal was back on its feet, bleating for its feed. Martin was not grateful. He was furious. His authority had been questioned, not by a man, but by a quiet woman and a handful of weeds. It was a humiliation he could not tolerate. That evening, he told her to pack her things. She was a burden the Lord had seen fit to lift from his shoulders. She had 2 books, the clothes on her back, and a cat. That was all the world had left of her marriage to Daniel. She did not argue. She simply nodded, packed her sack, and prepared to walk out into the November cold. The first night, she did not walk far. She found a shallow overhang of rock at the base of a low cliff, barely a mile from the settlement. The wind was a physical force, a predator hunting for any exposed piece of flesh. She huddled deep inside the thin shawl, the burlap sack with marmalade tucked inside her coat for warmth. The cat was a small, purring furnace against her ribs. She broke the bread in half, giving a small piece to the cat and chewing her own portion slowly, making it last. The bread was hard, but it was food. It was something. The cold seeped in through the soles of her boots. It was a deep, invasive cold that went straight to the bone. Sleep was impossible. She just sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. For 3 days, she survived on this edge. She moved during the warmest part of the day, which was still brutally cold, searching for better shelter. Her world shrank to a few simple, desperate needs: warmth, water, food. She found a small, frozen creek and broke the ice with a rock to drink the frigid water. It made her teeth ache. Her fingers, exposed for only a few moments, turned white and then an alarming shade of blue. She knew the signs of frostbite from her books. She tucked her hands into her armpits, forcing the blood back into them, the pain a nauseating wave of pins and needles. She was dizzy from hunger. The world seemed to tilt and sway. At one point, she stumbled and fell, her face hitting the frozen ground. She lay there for a long moment, the sharp cold against her cheek a strange comfort. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. To just let the cold take her. It would be a quiet end. No more struggle. No more being a burden. The thought was a warm, dark current pulling her under. Then, she felt a nudge against her side. A rough, sandy tongue licked her chin. Marmalade had worked his way out of the sack and was now butting his head against her, a low, insistent purr rumbling in his chest. It was a simple, animal demand. A demand for life. For warmth. For another day. The cat did not know despair. He only knew the cold and the need to fight it. Agnes pushed herself up, her joints screaming in protest. The body moves even when the mind wants to quit. She had to find shelter. Not for herself, but for this small, stubborn creature who refused to let her die. She began to search with a new focus, her eyes scanning the landscape not for a place to die, but for a place to live. She remembered a chapter in one of her geology books about the thermal properties of the Earth. It spoke of how south-facing hillsides absorbed more sun, how deep Earth held a constant, cool temperature, warmer than the winter air and cooler than the summer sun. She started following the base of a long, low ridge, her hand trailing along the frozen dirt and rock. She was looking for an anomaly. A place where the snow was thinner. A spot where a hint of green, a stubborn bit of moss, clung to life. Late in the afternoon of the 4th day, she found it. It was a subtle thing, easily missed. A shallow depression in the hillside, no bigger than a wagon wheel, where the snow had melted away entirely, leaving a patch of damp, dark earth. The air above it felt fractionally less cold. Anyone else would have walked right past it. But Agnes had spent years training her eyes to see the things others overlooked. She knelt, her frozen fingers probing the soil. It was loose. Not packed hard by frost. She began to dig, first with her hands, then using a flat piece of shale as a crude shovel. The work was exhausting. Every movement was a negotiation with the cold and her own screaming muscles. But a strange energy filled her. It was the thrill of a question about to be answered. An hour later, her shale spade hit something solid with a dull thud. It was not rock. It was wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She cleared the dirt away with frantic energy, uncovering a flat, horizontal surface. It was a door. A heavy, plank door, set flush into the hillside, its iron hinges thick with rust. There was no handle, only a large, square keyhole. She stopped, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She looked at the keyhole, then reached into her flour sack, her numb fingers fumbling for the strange iron key Daniel had left behind. It was heavy, ancient-looking. She had never understood why he kept it. Now, a wild, impossible hope bloomed in her chest. She pushed the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. With a groan of rusted metal, the lock turned. Agnes put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It gave way, swinging downwards into darkness. A wave of cool, damp air washed over her, smelling of earth, stone, and something else. Something like apples and cured meat. She dropped to her knees at the threshold, peering into the blackness. She felt no relief. She felt no joy. She felt something she had no word for, a feeling of profound and absolute recognition. This was it. This was the place she had been walking toward all her life. She lit a splinter of wood, her last match held in trembling hands. The small flame pushed back the darkness, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down. With marmalade tucked securely in her coat, she descended. The cellar was larger than she could have imagined. It was not a simple root cellar. It was a work of careful, intelligent design. The walls were lined with fitted stone, dry and solid. The air was cool but not freezing, holding at a constant temperature that felt almost warm compared to the world outside. Wooden shelves lined every wall, from the floor to the high, arched ceiling. And the shelves were full. It was a library of survival. There were hundreds of glass jars, their contents dark and mysterious in the flickering light. She held the flame closer. Pickled beans, beets, carrots. Jars of preserved peaches and pears, their golden color a memory of summer. There were sacks of potatoes, onions, and winter squash in wooden bins. Smoked hams and sides of bacon hung from iron hooks in the ceiling, wrapped in cheesecloth. There were barrels of flour, cornmeal, and salted fish. Tucked into a small alcove was a stack of wooden boxes filled with neatly organized packets of seeds. On a small, sturdy table sat a kerosene lamp, a can of fuel, and a box of matches. In that moment, Agnes understood. This was not an accident. This was a legacy. Someone, long ago, had built this sanctuary, had stocked it with a profound understanding of the land and the seasons, and then, for some reason, had never returned. She lit the lamp, and the room filled with a steady, golden light. She saw more details. A small, wood-burning stove in the corner, with a neat stack of dry firewood beside it. A cot, with a folded wool blanket at its foot. And on the table, next to the lamp, was a leather-bound journal. She sank onto the cot, the weight of the last few days crashing down on her. Marmalade hopped out of her coat and began to explore his new kingdom, his tail held high. Agnes opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise. The first entry was dated 1852. It was the journal of a man named Alastair, a botanist and surveyor who had come west to escape the crowded cities of the East. He wrote of building the cellar, of his experiments with food preservation, of his studies of the local flora. He had designed this place to be a self-sustaining home, a laboratory, and a fortress against the harshness of the world. For the next few weeks, Agnes did little more than exist. She ate. She slept. She fed the cat. The gnawing hunger in her belly slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, healing warmth. She ate slowly, tasting every bite. A spoonful of preserved peaches was a burst of impossible sweetness, a miracle in the frozen world above. She explored every corner of her new domain. She found a small seep spring in the back of the cellar, a constant drip of pure, cold water that collected in a stone basin. Alastair had carved a channel from the basin to a small drain, a simple but brilliant piece of engineering. This place was not just a storage room. It was alive. As her strength returned, her mind began to wake up. She did not just consume the supplies. She began to catalogue them, to understand them. She read Alistair's journal every night by lamplight, his quiet, methodical voice speaking to her across the decades. He was a kindred spirit, a man who saw the world as a series of fascinating problems to be solved. He wrote of the specific humidity required to cure meat properly, of the best way to store root vegetables to prevent rot, of the precise blend of herbs that would keep mice away. He had written it all down. Agnes was not just his heir. She was his student. She began to build. She used a small hand axe she found in a crate to chop more firewood from a deadfall pine near the cellar entrance, working only during the brief hours of daylight. She camouflaged the entrance with dead branches and packed snow, making it all but invisible. She created a routine. Mornings were for work, checking the stores, tending the small stove, venturing out for wood and water. Afternoons were for study, reading Alistair's books and journals. Evenings were for quiet reflection, sitting on the cot with marmalade purring on her lap, the silence of the earth around her a comforting blanket. The silence was different here. It was not the empty, terrifying silence of the wilderness. It was the full, resonant silence of a library, a place of deep peace and accumulated knowledge. The first great blizzard hit in late December. It came without warning, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind screamed for 3 straight days. From her shelter, Agnes heard it as a distant, muffled roar. She kept the stove warm, ate a hearty stew of salted fish and potatoes, and read about seed germination. She thought of the settlement, of Martin and Sarah in their small, drafty house. She wondered if they had enough firewood. She wondered if their stores would last. The thought came without bitterness, a simple, detached observation. The blizzard was a test, and she knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would pass. This was the first proof. She was not just surviving. She was thriving. The world that had cast her out was now the one in peril, while she was safe in the heart of the earth. In late January, a visitor arrived. Agnes was outside, clearing snow from the cellar's hidden ventilation shaft, when she saw a figure moving through the trees. It was a woman, dressed in buckskin and furs, moving with the easy, silent grace of someone who belonged to the forest. The woman carried no rifle, only a long staff. She stopped about 30 yards away, her eyes missing nothing. Agnes did not run. She did not hide. She simply stood her ground, her hand resting on the handle of her axe. The woman was older, her face a roadmap of hard seasons, but her eyes were clear and sharp. "Your smoke is clean," the woman said, her voice raspy but strong. "No grease. No wet wood. You know what you're doing." Agnes just nodded. The woman introduced herself as Maeve. She lived alone, a few miles deeper in the mountains. She was a healer, a trapper, an outcast of a different sort. The settlement tolerated her for her knowledge of herbs but kept her at a distance. Maeve had been tracking a snowshoe hare when she saw the faint wisp of smoke from Agnes's flue. She was intrigued. No one from the settlement ventured this far in winter. Maeve did not ask how Agnes had come to be there. She did not ask about the cellar. She saw the quiet competence in Agnes's eyes and recognized it as her own. She looked at the carefully stacked firewood, the well-cleared path to the spring. "You have a good hand for this life," she observed. Their friendship was built not on shared stories of sorrow, but on shared knowledge. Maeve knew the forest. She taught Agnes how to set snares, how to read animal tracks, how to find the inner bark of the pine tree, which could be ground into a life-saving flour. Agnes, in turn, shared the knowledge from Alistair's books. She showed Maeve passages on crop rotation and soil preservation. They were 2 solitary women, each possessing a piece of a larger puzzle. Together, they were more complete. News of Agnes's survival trickled back to Prairie Ridge. A trapper, checking his lines, had seen her smoke. He reported that the widow Martin had cast out was somehow still alive. The news was met with disbelief, then suspicion. The preacher warned of strange powers at work in the woods, of a woman who had turned her back on God's charity and embraced something darker. But as the winter deepened, the settlement supplies began to dwindle. The blizzard had collapsed the roof of the general store, spoiling half their flour. A sickness, a deep, rattling cough, began to move from house to house. The first to seek her out was a young mother whose child was burning with fever. She came hesitantly, driven by desperation, having heard tales of Maeve's healing arts. Maeve was with Agnes when the woman arrived. They listened to her panicked story, then went to work. Agnes, remembering a passage in Alistair's journal, ground willow bark into a powder. Maeve added dried elderflowers and peppermint from her own stores. They sent the mother home with the herbal tea and careful instructions. 2 days later, the child's fever broke. The woman paid them with a knitted scarf. It was the first act of community Agnes had experienced in months, not an act of charity, but an exchange between equals. A trade of skill for skill. Slowly, cautiously, others followed. They came not for Agnes, but for what she could provide. They came for a cup of flour, a few potatoes, a remedy for the croup. They traded what little they had, a handful of nails, a mended pot, a few feet of rope. Agnes never asked about their lives in the settlement. She never spoke of Martin. She dealt in the currency of the present, a jar of dried herbs for a ball of twine. Her cellar, her sanctuary, was becoming an economy. The community that had rejected her now depended on the very qualities they had scorned, her quiet observation, her careful planning, her bookish knowledge. They did not understand her. But hunger and sickness are powerful converters of skepticism. They began to see her not as the strange widow, but as the woman in the hill. The hardest winter in a decade settled over the mountains in February. The snow piled in deep, impassable drifts. The temperature stayed below zero for weeks. The settlement was cut off. Game was scarce. They were starving. One evening, as the light was fading, Agnes saw a figure staggering through the snow at the edge of her clearing. He was gaunt, his face hollowed out by hunger and exhaustion. It was Martin. He did not look like the hard, certain man who had closed his door on her. He looked small. He looked broken. The cruelty had gone out of him, replaced by a raw, animal fear. He stopped when he saw her, leaning heavily on a walking stick. He did not meet her eyes. He stared at the ground, at the smoke curling from her chimney. "The children," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Sarah, the children have not eaten in 2 days." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not say he was wrong. He stated a fact. He needed food. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. She saw the man who had condemned her to die in the cold. But she also saw the desperation of a father. The two were not separate things. They were the same man. She turned without a word and went back into the cellar. Maeve was there, mending a snowshoe. She had seen Martin arrive. She watched Agnes, her expression unreadable. Agnes did not look at her. She walked to the back of the cellar, to the smoked hams hanging from the ceiling. She took down a small one. She filled a sack with potatoes, onions, and a bag of cornmeal. She added a jar of preserved peaches. She walked back up the stone steps and out into the twilight. She handed the heavy sack to Martin. He took it, his hands shaking. He still would not look at her. "How many people are in the settlement?" she asked. Her voice was calm, a simple logistical question. 23, he mumbled. "The preacher's family has it the worst." "This will last you a week," she said. "Send 2 men back in 3 days. I will have more ready. Tell them to bring a sled." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a confusion that was deeper than gratitude. He could not understand. He had left her to die, and she was feeding his children. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He just stood there, clutching the sack of food. "The road will be hard going back," Agnes said, turning away. "You should start now." It was a dismissal. Forgiveness was not a word to be spoken. It was a ham and a bag of potatoes. It was the simple, irrefutable act of giving when nothing was owed. Martin left. He did not look back. 3 days later, 2 men from the settlement arrived with a sled. They were shamefaced and quiet. Agnes gave them enough food for another 2 weeks. They offered her money, the last of the town's emergency fund. She refused it. "Bring me salt when the thaw comes," she said. And lamp oil. She was not giving charity. She was trading. When spring finally arrived, melting the world into a muddy, brown river, a small delegation came from the town, led by the preacher. Martin was with them. He stood at the back, his head bowed. The preacher cleared his throat and spoke of God's mysterious ways, of the mercy shown to his flock. Agnes listened patiently. When he was finished, she said nothing. Martin stepped forward. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound photograph in a worn wooden frame. It was a picture of her and Daniel, taken on their wedding day. It was the one thing she had left behind, the one thing she had mourned. "This belongs to you," Martin said, holding it out. It was not an apology. But it was an acknowledgement. It was something that cost him a piece of his pride to return. Agnes took it. "Thank you, Martin," she said. The forgiveness was in the saying of his name without anger. That was all that was needed. Agnes lived in the hillside for another 30 years. She never returned to the settlement, but the settlement came to her. She taught them. She taught them how to read the sky, how to amend the soil, how to preserve the harvest. She showed them which plants could heal and which could feed. The cellar, Alistair's gift, became a communal larder, a seed bank, a library. Maeve stayed with her, the 2 women growing old together in the quiet rhythm of the seasons. They fed hundreds. They taught dozens. The knowledge passed from them into the hands of the next generation. Agnes died on a warm afternoon in early autumn. She was sitting in a chair she had built herself, just outside the door to her home. A cup of chicory tea was still warm on the stool beside her. A book lay open in her lap. Marmalade V, a descendant of the original, slept at her feet. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying story. They buried her on the hillside, under a tall pine tree. Her headstone, carved by a man whose child she had saved, had only 3 words on it. Agnes. She fed us. There is a door inside you that you have been told is worthless. A room filled with a quiet knowledge the world has no category for. You have been told it is strange, unproductive, a waste of time. You have been standing outside that door in the cold for a very long time. Maybe it is time to find the key. Maybe it is time to see what happens when you finally turn the lock and step inside. The iron key her husband left her was the first clue. It was a piece of a story she did not yet know she was in. Every life has a key like that, an object or a memory that makes no sense until the day it fits the one lock it was made for. If these are the stories that matter to you, consider subscribing to our channel. We will be here next week, in the heart of another winter, with another quiet life that refused to be forgotten.